Hi, I'm Daniel Zwerdling.
And I'm David Shipler. Two reporters start now.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Great, thanks. And as you know, our mission today is to hear how our guest and two of his colleagues did some amazing reporting. And as a result, these journalists helped topple one of the worst dictators in the world. This dictator had his opponents tortured and murdered. He and his cronies stole billions of dollars from their country and hid them in foreign companies and bank accounts.
So we're going to go back in time now to the 1980s, and we're going to hear about Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, which, of course, has been one of the closest American allies in the Pacific.
And our guide is Louis Simons. Lou spent more than 50 years as a foreign correspondent, and now he's written a memoir about it. It's called To Tell the Truth. Lou tells some chilling stories in the book, and in our last episode, we hope you hear it, he talked about his time covering the Vietnam War. Here's an excerpt.
We approached a rice paddy. We're separated, I would guess, by about 10 feet from man to man. And the guy in front of me, I hear a very soft click, and then boom, 1 foot and a leg from the knee down were blown off right there.
No, God.
And incredibly, I started taking notes.
Among other things, we'll talk with Lou in a bit about something foreign correspondents seldom discuss in public. Their jobs are incredibly tough on their spouses and on their families. But first,
Lou tells us how he started covering the story that ended up winning him and two of his colleagues the Pulitzer Prize. This was years after his stint in Vietnam. It was 1983. And then he was working for the San Jose Mercury News in California.
And as Lou tells the story, he's standing in the newsroom in San Jose, and one of his editors walks up and hands him a piece of paper.
Right. It's a narrow strip of paper about 3 inches wide at the most, and it's just been torn off the AP printer. Just a couple of lines of type saying that a man by the name of Ninoy Aquino has just been shot dead at the airport in Manila, the Philippines. Ninoy Aquino was the arch enemy of Ferdinand Marcos, the man who was then the dictator of the Philippines. And Aquino had been in exile in Boston for several years. He needed heart surgery. He had been in jail. Marcos let him go rather than having him die in prison or executing him, which would have been a very unpopular move in the Philippines. So Ninoy went off to Boston. He was teaching at Harvard. He had influential friends. One of them was Teddy Kennedy. He had his wife and his daughters with him and son, and he had a very nice and happy life. Then he came to know that Ferdinand Marcos was ill, possibly dying, and yet was going to run again for re-election. And Ninoy thought, this is my moment. I either go back now and run against him, or my political career in the Philippines is finished. I'll spend the rest of my life as an exile in the United States. So he went back.
And before we go on with the story, can I give our listeners like a 30-second summary?
Please.
Because the Philippines is kind of outside most people's radar.
Mm-hmm.
Ferdinand Marcos had been elected initially to be the president in the mid-1960s.
Right.
And at first he was kind of a reformer.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he passed policies that helped poor people and all that. But only a handful of years later, he declared martial law, a very common practice among leaders around the world. And by the time you got there, he'd been a dictator for years. Human rights groups documented his government arrested and tortured tens of thousands of people. They had thousands of opponents killed. Everybody suspected, but couldn't prove, that he was stealing mind-boggling amounts of money from the country. And meanwhile, U.S. leaders praised him as a great man upholding democracy.
Right.
Why?
Well, the Philippines was, prior to World War II, the only actual colony the United States ever owned. Puerto Rico, Cuba had colonial style relations, but the Philippines was a genuine colony. And we had used it from World War II onward as a critical military base. It was the base for the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, to project American power across the Pacific.
And in fact, here's an old newsreel about it.
The Philippine Islands are an essential link in the free world's defense arc in the Far East. Because they lie only 400 miles from communist-held China, for the mutual protection of the new republic and the U.S., American bases have been set up throughout the island.
And at the time, these bases were said to be irreplaceable. If the U.S. were ever to lose these bases, we might as well just pack up and withdraw back to Los Angeles. It was all over. That would be proven false ultimately, but at that time, everyone accepted it. So the U.S. went along with Marcos. Furthermore, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States at the point that I'm talking about when Ninoy Aquino was assassinated. Ronald Reagan and his wife, Nancy, were dear personal friends with Ferdinand Marcos and his wife, Imelda.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan.
Mr. President, Mrs. Marcos, it gives me special pleasure to welcome you to the United States. Mrs. Reagan and I have been long looking forward to returning the hospitality you showed us on our 1969 visit to your country. Our two peoples enjoy a close friendship, one forged in shared history and common ideals. Yours, Mr. President, is a respected voice for reason and moderation.
So let's go back to 1983. Marcos' most popular opponent has been, as you say, has been living in exile in the U.S., Aquino. He flies back to Manila. They land on the tarmac.
And what happened at the airport?
Okay. So on board this plane, the last leg of the flight that Ninoy took starting in Boston to Manila, he was joined on that flight by a number of foreign journalists. He gave interviews as the flight crossed the Pacific to Manila, and he told everybody, told the reporters, he knew that he was in for trouble.
And here's an excerpt from one of the interviews that Aquino gave on that flight. This was for Time magazine.
You have to be very ready with your hand camera because this action can become very fast.
Yes.
In a matter of 3-4 minutes, it could be all over, And I may not be able to talk to you again after this. So this is the danger. Now, I am taking some precaution. I have my bulletproof vest, hoping that will be some kind of a protection. But if they hit me in the head, there's nothing we can do there.
And the plane landed. Ninoy was taken down a metal stairway, down a side exit door, usually used by cleaning crews and mechanics. He was taken down by armed soldiers. He barely took his second step down the gangplank, if you will.
Philippine opposition leader Benigno Aquino returned home to Manila today from exile and was immediately shot to death at the Manila airport. His assassin...
It all happened in a few confusing minutes. One moment, the Filipino opposition leader, Benigno Aquino, was being led off the aircraft in a quiet, almost friendly manner. Minutes later, shots rang out. There was pandemonium aboard the aircraft.
The bullet went through his brain and exited from his chin, and he fell dead on the tarmac. That was followed by more shots, this time at a man standing on the tarmac in the blue coveralls of an airport cleaning crew member. That man fell dead after a handful of shots. From that moment on, the story that was spun by the government was that the killer was the man in the blue coveralls.
His assassin, a lone gunman, was promptly killed by soldiers.
That he was a gun for hire working for the Communist Party of the Philippines. And nobody who was on the air, I was not on the airplane, by the way. I was, as we've said, I was in San Jose, California on summer vacation. The reporters and the photographers and the camera people on the plane did not for a moment believe that. They weren't able to exit the plane with Aquino, but they could see enough through the windows to know that the shot came from behind him, from above him on the gangplank, not from the ground.
So that's what prompted you for your editor to send you to the Philippines.
The bulletin, the 1-line, 2-line bulletin didn't give any of what I just told you, just that he was shot and killed. I knew what he meant to Marcos. I knew what he meant to the Philippines. And so I said to the editor, I'm going right now. I absolutely deserted my wife and 2 little kids right there in his office. You take care of them and get them back to Tokyo. That's where we were based at the time. And I left. And 24 hours later, I was in Manila.
And you investigated the murder.
Yeah.
What did you find, and what else did you turn up as you did that investigation about Marcos and his corruption?
So the investigation was long and drawn out for a couple of years by the Philippine authorities. It was in Marcos's best interest to not come to an answer, and certainly not one that would implicate him and his government. I did learn exclusively, actually, from a member of the investigative board that had been appointed by the government, that the chief of the armed forces, a general by the name of Ver, V-E-R, was responsible for the murder of Aquino, that he had done it because he and Imelda Marcos and the rest of the cronies around the president believed that he was going to die very soon. They were worried that unless they got rid of Aquino, that he would be elected. They had plans for Mrs. Marcos and then their children, one after another, to succeed Ferdinand and become leaders. So they arranged the assassination. I learned that, and that was a huge, huge story that was played all around the world. But as I was doing this investigation of the murder, and before I broke the story, I began hearing, I would meet mornings and lunchtime, dinner time with various groups of influential people and some not so influential people, Filipinos, who would tell me stories about what became known to me as the Marcoses' hidden wealth or hidden billions. And it turned out that they had a menu, a long list of very valuable real estate properties in New York City, in the San Francisco Bay Area, Long Island, out of the US, in Australia, the UK. And then they had vast amounts of cash stowed away, what they called salted. They salted dollars that they stole from the Philippine Treasury in front organizations in the Caribbean. And
But wait a minute, Lou. Forgive me for interjecting, but these days, it's incredibly hard to investigate this kind of, theft by foreign leaders or corporate executives. But we have the internet, we have computers, we have all kinds of amazing databases where you can get some bits and pieces of financial information to help you on a detective hunt.
Okay.
Here you are in the early 1980s. How did you and your team, how did you go about, give us some very specific examples. Who would you talk to? What dusty archive would you go into and look at microfilms or something? I mean, how did you piece all this together?
Yeah, great point. So I didn't. What I was doing was collecting this list. Eventually, I wrote, I think it was something like 20-page memo back to my editor in San Jose. And I said, this is what I'm hearing. Here are all the details I'm able to gather. I can't go any further with it here. I can't get access to the Marcoses, file cabinets and their bank accounts. Since a lot of these properties are in the San Jose area, in the Bay Area, and others are in New York City and around the U.S. Do you have a reporter back there who can begin checking this out? Well, my editor went to one or two investigative reporters that they employed in San Jose in the newsroom, a brilliant reporter by the name of Pete Carey. And Pete, in addition to being as we all were in those days, a shoe leather reporter.
Meaning actually walking the streets and interviewing people.
Yeah, exactly. Pounding on doors and making phone calls and all of that. But Pete also was one of the earliest users of the internet. To be honest, back then in the mid-'80s, I barely knew what the internet was. I didn't even have a computer. I did my filing of stories by writing them on a portable typewriter and then taking the copy to the cable office. I guess that's something that doesn't exist any longer either. And bribing an operator to put it ahead of other people's files and send it off to San Jose.
Bribing? I'm shocked, Lou.
I'm sure you are.
Come on, let's admit it. I think a lot of foreign correspondents have bribed people, company included, at some points in our careers. In some countries, it was the only way to get a telephone line or board a plane, even with a ticket.
So Pete knew all about the internet, what there was to know at the time. And he began gaining access to records, real estate records in San Francisco, New York. And then the editor took on another reporter, a young woman by the name of Catherine Ellison, who was a tough-minded reporter. And once between Pete and me, we were able to nail down certain properties that was clearly owned by Ferdinand or Imelda or one of their cronies. Catherine would go knock on the door if they had a property in the Bay Area and they were there for a time. She would knock on the door and say, "Listen, we've got this record here. It says you own X, Y, and Z buildings and they're worth, $5 million apiece. What do you say?"
And you describe in your book how some of the people at those properties who answered her insistent knocking turned out to be Marcos cronies. They were cabinet ministers, Marcos friends, or politicians close to them, and they would admit they owned the properties. And your investigation showed how the Marcoses would also use frontmen and frontwomen to hide their own involvement.
So that's how we did it. We broke that story over 3 days, starting on a Sunday. It was massive.
Tonight, the shocking story of the Marcos family fortune.
How the fortune was accumulated and who covered up the Marcos.
Tonight on Frontline, the couple accused of stealing billions of dollars from the Philippines.
Mr. Marcos and his wife.
And most importantly, it broke in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines at that time was still under dictatorship. The press was either directly censored by the government or self-censored by nervous editors. They could not print that story per se. So what editors of those papers did in order to get the word out and yet still not subject themselves to arrest was they would print a mocking kind of a lead saying, "Can you imagine this small paper in Northern California just printed this ridiculous thing about our president," and then they run the whole thing.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Oh, that's great.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then there was an opposition press operated by the Catholic Church, which is extremely powerful in the Philippines. The Philippines is the only Asian country that is Catholic. The opposition parties reprinted the series of articles in pamphlet form. And they spread these pamphlets all over the country. They dropped them out of helicopters and small airplanes.
Really?
I think it's worth reminding the listeners we're talking to Lou Simons, who wrote a memoir based on his many years of being a foreign correspondent, in which he covered every major event in Asia for 30 years, as far as I can tell. The book is To Tell the Truth: My Life as a Foreign Correspondent.
So what was the effect among people in the little street stalls having their, soups, people in coffee shops? To what extent did your series cause waves?
Yeah, the reaction was kind of complicated in the sense that Filipinos have a very, certainly then, and still too, have a love-hate relationship with the United States. On the one hand, we were their colonial masters for 50 years after 500 years of being subjected by Spain as the Spanish colony. So they resent us. At the same time, they love our culture, they love our music, they love our movies. They emigrate here whenever they can. There was a long period of time when young Filipino men were allowed to join the U.S. Navy, mostly as messmen working.
That's right. Yeah, I remember on my ship there were Filipino messmen, and in exchange, I think they ended up getting citizenship, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. I mean, at any time you can walk past the U.S. Embassy in Manila, and there'll be a line from inside the compound out onto the street that'll run for a quarter of a mile with hundreds of people lined up every single day to collect their Social Security checks because they've worked in the United States and lived there for some time. So on the one hand, they were thrilled to see this information. It had been rumored for decades that the Marcoses were stealing money, but here it was, and it was in an American newspaper. So they were thrilled to see it, but damn it, why wasn't it in a Filipino newspaper? Why didn't we investigate it ours? It was that kind of a complication.
And what political effect did it have then? How did that translate into opposition to Marcos?
Well, what happened was that once that story landed here in the U.S., Congress got on it, and Congress began holding its own investigation. It was fascinating that there were people in Congress who were very anti-Marcos and wanted to get him out of there.
And it's important to remember that the U.S. Congress kept voting huge amounts of aid, money,
exactly,
for the Philippines.
Indeed. As I say, most of it because of the bases. So Congress got after the Reagan administration, and people within the administration began flying out to Manila to talk to Marcos. And the long and the short of it is they essentially ordered him. They didn't ask him. They ordered him to hold elections quickly that became known as a snap election. It was very complicated and involved. But the bottom line was that he lost the election to Cory Aquino. And this sort of set the stage for Donald Trump and what happened here with the Trump-Biden election. Marcos would not accept the result. There was a moment where they both got themselves sworn in by their own priests. There was a moment when they had two presidents, but the White House said, enough, Marcos, it's up. The jig is up. It's time to leave. Cut and cut cleanly was the line they used.
Good evening from CBS News. As part of our special coverage on the Philippines, this is Newsbreak. Ferdinand Marcos arrived on the U.S. island of Guam several hours ago to begin his exile from the Philippines. In Manila to celebrate Marcos's resignation as president and Corazon Aquino replacing him, crowds surged through the streets, overran the presidential palace, where they smashed furnishings and pictures and carried off valuables. The United States praised the mostly peaceful transition of power. Secretary of State
Now,
Schultz
we
said
all
Marcos
want to
would be
think
welcomed.
that our reporting has made an impact. And the investigative series that you and your colleagues did won the Pulitzer Prize because you essentially proved that the Marcos family was stealing massive amounts of money from the Philippines. But beyond getting your prestigious award, or I should say, and beyond getting your award, do you feel deep down inside, do you feel that your reporting actually helped unravel the Marcos government?
There's no question. There's no question. And it's just not my thinking, which would be suspect. Let me see if I can find it here. Let's see. Yeah, here. There's a book. It's called The Pulitzer Prize Archive. And this is what they said in 1986 after our Pulitzer. Doubtless, the investigative stories and exposés of the San Jose Mercury News team can be called one of the greatest successes in the history of the internationally oriented Pulitzer Prizes. And there were entries into the congressional record here that said things like this series of articles led directly to the overthrow of the Marcos regime.
It raises another assignment where you were, and that was India. You wrote about Indira Gandhi's corruption. Of course, she declared a state of emergency for a while, which put lots of people in jail. And you were expelled from India in 1975, I think. Tell us about that. Why did that happen? Why would they expel such a good guy like you?
Good question. Yes. Okay. So what happened was that Indira Gandhi was prime minister.
A momentous day for India. In Parliament House, members were to elect a prime minister. Indira Gandhi is the daughter of the late Premier Nehru, father of independent India. And when it was time for the result to be declared, Mrs. Gandhi was elected by a large majority. Perhaps no other woman in history has borne so tremendous a responsibility, leading the government of 450 million people.
In any event, in the time period that we're talking about...
And you're talking about the mid-1970s. She'd been prime minister for years.
Correct. Her opposition, which was aware of corruption in the government, began campaigning actively and publicly against her, which is something that nobody had ever done before. And they accused her of utilizing Indian military aircraft and personnel for her re-election campaign. And they took her to court, and the court found her guilty and ordered her to abandon the prime ministership, abandon her seat in parliament, and to not be engaged in politics again for a period of 6 years. And she refused to accept that. And she instead launched her own counteroffensive of rallies and speeches across the country. And like every other reporter in New Delhi, I covered those events. I covered both sides. Covering one of her events, a key event, I saw people working as sort of crowd managers and handing out cups of water and doing various things to support her day of demonstrations. And these guys looked suspiciously like soldiers. They had cropped hair and they were very neat and polished shoes and so on. And then lo and behold, I came across in uniform a colonel, an army colonel who I knew, an Indian. And I knew him well, knew him socially. And I said, who are these guys? And he said, they're Jawans. Jawan is the Hindi word for soldiers. And I said, are they supposed to be here? Is it? And he sort of rolled his eyes and said, and then I ran into another guy, a captain or a major, I can't recall, who I knew. And I asked him the same thing. And he said, yes, they're soldiers. I said, are they supposed to be here? And he said, no, they're not supposed to be doing this at all. So that night, I went home, went back to my office, and I wrote a story. We should make clear, by the way, that this is for the Washington Post. This is prior to San Jose Mercury and Philippine and so on. I filed a story on the day's demonstrations. It includes what I just told you about, that these soldiers were there participating illegally. Well, I went to bed that night, and that morning I was sitting in my office. I had a little office behind our house in Delhi. I was typing away, and the door suddenly is thrown open, and there are 3 Indian armed police armed with rifles, old British Army style Enfield rifles. One guy has a stick, a baton in his hand, and he says, come with us. Why? Come with us. And no answer. Anyway, they hustled me into a police car. They took me down to the immigration office. They canceled my visa with, rubber stamps and all of that. The guy wielding the rubber stamps was somebody I had come to know. I'd been there for 3 years at the time. Every time I left the country, this was standard procedure, I was required to go to his office and get an exit permit. When I came back from wherever I was outside the country, I'd get a reentry permit. So we got to know each other. He was a very reasonable fellow, and we would have tea and cookies together and schmooze. This time was a whole different story, very cold. And I said to him, what the hell is going on here? This is India. This is the world's largest democracy. What is going on here? And first he put his hands over his eyes, and then his ears, and then his mouth. Monkey, no see, no hear, no speak. I said, come on, what is going on? He said, look, I'm a public servant. I eat her salt.
I eat her salt. Wow.
Eat her salt. And 5 hours later, I was on a plane for Bangkok. My poor, long-suffering wife and our 2 little girls were left behind.
And they cut off her bank account, right? She couldn't even pay bills.
They cut off her bank account. They cut off the phone line. They had an armed policeman on the corner outside our house taking down license plate numbers of anybody who had the temerity to come and visit her and offer condolences or help or, whatever. And so people were afraid to come. I mean, my wife really suffered. She was in a very bad way. And then it was the 4th of July. I had left a couple of days earlier. She's got these 2 little girls in the house. They don't know what's going on. Where's Daddy? So she said, okay, kids, we're going to go to the American Embassy. It's the 4th of July. We'll have hot dogs and hamburgers and Coca-Cola, and it will be great fun. So she gets to the embassy. It's a very imposing building in which the ambassador lives. It's called Roosevelt House, big granite towering edifice. And she walks in the front door, and the receiving line is there. The ambassador is flanked by the military attaché, who I think was a colonel at the time, wearing his white summer tunic and this fruit salad of ribbons on his chest. And next to him is his wife. And my wife just fell on this woman weeping and said, and the ambassador said, "What the hell's going on here?" And somebody gave him whispered a quick story. And he said, "Get this woman out of here and get her all the help she needs." And the next morning, Carol and our two little girls were taken to the airport by an American embassy car. They went past immigration, past all procedures, right onto the airplane. And they flew to Hong Kong. I flew from Bangkok to Hong Kong. And my wife then suffered a nervous breakdown and ended up in the hospital.
Oh my.
She was in the hospital for about a week. And she came out and she was in a state of depression.
Well, Lou, I think you've just raised a really important and difficult issue that foreign correspondents struggle with all the time, which is that their work is not only dangerous. I mean, you almost got blown up several times, you got shot at, but in addition, work like yours often takes a terrible toll on the correspondents' families, on your relationships.
And Lou, as a friend, I know that your wife, Carol, is okay. She's fine.
Yeah.
And she's okay with us talking about this issue.
Yeah, we discussed it, yeah.
She was a journalist herself, but she didn't travel much for her job the way you did. So tell us a bit, if you would, about how your work as a roving correspondent affected Carol and your family so much that she eventually had that breakdown you just told us about after you were kicked out of India.
Right. My being away so frequently and the pressures that meant for Carol, I think the most extreme example was when I was summoned from my base in Delhi to go down to Cambodia for what was meant to be 2 weeks to give the correspondent there a break to get out of the country. And that turned out to be 3 months. 2 weeks turned into 3 months. I was in Cambodia, and then I went to Laos.
And so, bye, dear, see you in a few weeks, became, bye, dear, see you in a few months. And I don't even know when exactly.
That's right. She knew where I was, but we had no contact. I mean, there were no cell phones. She was alone. She had 2 little children. The children themselves frequently were sick with various stomach ailments, as was Carol, and that put a great deal of strain on her. It's not like being in your own home. No matter how long you're in a particular country or a city, it's not your culture. Yes, you have friends, but they're not really your friends that you grew up with and that you've cultivated over a lifetime. It becomes very stressful.
So, Lou, I imagine some people might be asking themselves, well, how come you didn't say no? Did it ever occur to you to say, look, sorry, I'm at my limit here. I can't do this to my family anymore?
That's a tough question, David. The answer is no. It wasn't that I took go to Cambodia. I wasn't as if I took that as an order, but it just seemed like the obvious thing to do. And Carol didn't object. Thinking back on it now, it's a really good point you make. Why didn't she say, for God's sake, no, don't do it? It never arose. It never came to anything even close to that. And since my book has come out, various people we know, women in particular, have said to me and to Carol, "My God, how did you do it? I wouldn't do it. If the situation, if it was my husband, there's just no way I could put up with that, and I wouldn't." But she did, and it was because she herself had this background in journalism.
Yeah.
There was never any question. I know this is no longer acceptable in polite society, but there was never any question that we were abroad for me, for my job, for my ambitions. Carol would have been just as happy being in Washington or New York or somewhere in the States doing her own work. Her own work in journalism was reduced to freelancing and stringing and that kind of thing. And it was never fully satisfactory for her.
But the marriage held up quite well, and that's not always the case, is it?
You're still together.
Absolutely. We're still together. Interestingly enough, When I had my book launch at Politics and Prose, a famous bookshop here in Washington, there was a fellow in the audience who I knew. I've known for many, many years. He is currently on his fourth wife.
And he was a foreign correspondent.
A foreign correspondent, a wire service correspondent. Two of his wives left him because of the strains and stresses of being abandoned so often and for such long periods of time. And he asked me, why do you think Carol stayed with you when my wives, two of them, left me?
Well, that's an awkward question.
The answer I gave him and the answer I would still give is that Carol understood. She knew what it meant to me. And I think this is generational. I don't know that it would happen anymore, but she was willing, if not quite happy, to accept it.
Wow. Well, thank you for talking about that. Can we go back to India for a moment, though? Because there's a coda to your story about how they kicked you out, basically with no warning.
Which I think is a reporter's nightmare, as I read it in your book, is you took your notebooks out or tried to take your notebooks with you, and they were confiscated at the airport in Delhi. And you got them back sometime later with the names of people in your notebooks underlined.
Yeah.
And you learned that they had all been arrested, right?
Correct. They had taken from me at the Delhi airport, I suppose, 20 reporters' notebooks. And yes, all of the names of my sources were in there. And when they arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok, where I was living, it was a year later, all of the names of the interviewees and sources were underlined in red. And I checked back with my contacts in India. And yes, every single one of them had been arrested. Fortunately, nobody really suffered. They weren't tortured or,
They were held and then released in a short time, were they?
And then released, yeah.
But that is every reporter's worst nightmare.
So what was the lesson?
I learned that you can't do that. If you're in a dicey situation, you can't just write down people's names without realizing that this kind of thing could happen. These notebooks could fall into dangerous hands. So from then on, I just sort of made up a code system using letters or numbers or something that would ring a bell for me and wouldn't mean anything to an outsider. Although, in all honesty, never again were my notebooks confiscated anywhere else.
Well, Lou, you tell so many gripping and many upsetting stories in this book. We could spend many days. And before we say thank you, goodbye, I want to get you to read one passage. Let's not go into detail, but you covered horrendous historic ethnic massacres in the country that broke off from Pakistan to become Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And please read, it's on page 135.
Where do you want me to start?
It's the third paragraph. It starts, have you ever seen? And of course,
okay, yeah, I got it.
Like you did in so many other countries, when there was danger, you were there. You've just landed in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. You were literally registering at your hotel, and a fellow reporter says, hey, the freedom fighters are holding a victory rally. So, of course, you go to the rally, which is in a stadium, right?
It's in an open race course, a horse racing course. Yeah.
And you see right in front of you the most horrendous massacre. Just read that paragraph, please.
Okay. Have you ever seen a human stomp another? Stomp. Smash the heel of his boot into noses and eye sockets over and over until the fragile bone crunch and shatter. Have you ever watched deep red blood and pink intestine spill from a bayonet slash to the stomach? Have you ever heard the unholy screaming? Have you looked into the maddened, sweating face of a gray-bearded man as he slams the butt of his rifle into the throat of a teenaged boy splayed on the ground? Over and over again. Have you stood there, close enough to touch either of them, said nothing, while writing in a notebook? I have.
And I want to get back to something we talked about briefly early in our chat, about how you learned somehow to become an observer You take notes while people are being shot all around you, blown up in some cases. And you said somehow it's never really affected you emotionally like it has many other journalists. So you don't ever lose sleep where you wake up in the middle of the night and you see one of these images, or you have a nightmare, you haven't had any kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, seriously, which a lot of journalists do have who cover these events.
No, to be honest, I have not. I mean, sometimes I've wondered about myself and wondered how this could be. I mean, sometimes I guess I feel a little guilty and wonder, is there something wrong with me? Why don't I feel horrible? Why don't I have night sweats and horrible nightmares? I do know more than a few journalists, colleagues who were in Vietnam with me or in other places, including Bangladesh, who have suffered that way and never really got beyond it. What can I say? For some unknown reason, I've escaped that. I guess I'm grateful and should be grateful for it.
Well, I think so. And it's not as if you are a cold person, not at all. I mean, I know you well enough to know you're not. You're a deeply warm and compassionate person. I guess we all process these experiences in different ways. And my own feeling is that being a reporter at the time, watching this, is a kind of therapy in a sense. I mean, you see it, but then you write about it. So it's not as if it hangs inside you unprocessed. You write about it. And therefore, I don't know, somehow that process, at least for me, that process itself helps to, I don't know exactly what the right word is. It helps you deal with it in a way.
Yeah. There's a couple of paragraphs in the book when I'm in Cambodia, and Cambodia is about to fall to the Khmer Rouge communists. And I'm walking along a boulevard, the center of town, and I hear a shot. It's a shotgun being fired, and a soldier in uniform, a Cambodian soldier, passes me by and then falls dead on the sidewalk, and his brain spills out of the top of his head. And I watched the whole thing and jotted in my notebook, he's robbed the bank, and the armed guard there has shot and killed him. And I look at this grisly, gory scene and write it down in my notebook. And I rationalized it at the time. Around that time, the Colgate toothpaste company had a slogan for something they called the invisible shield.
Of all leading brands, only Colgate contains Gardol. And here's how Gardol works. Now, just as I was protected by this invisible shield, Colgate with Gardol forms an invisible protective shield around your teeth.
And I say to myself, I have my own Colgate shield, and I can stand behind that shield and witness anything, and it somehow will not get into my mind and haunt me for the rest of my life.
Lou Simon's book, his memoir, is called To Tell the Truth, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent.
It's a great book. And you write so well, of course. That's your job, but you really do.
And the foreword is by the Dalai Lama, but you'll have to read the book to read about how Lou knows the Dalai Lama.
Yes, it's a great story in and of itself.
Lou, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, guys, both of you. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much for all your time and your remarkable career that's helped a lot of people understand parts of the world they would not have had much understanding of. Thanks very much, Lou.
Okay, take care, guys.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
We hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org or tworeporters.net. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.